The night was clear enough that it worked against them. The moon sat full and bright over the Sibutu Passage on June 6, 1944, painting the surface of the water in silver, and when the USS Harder came up to make her approach run on the convoy, the moon caught her hull and lit it up for the entire Japanese escort to see. 3 empty tankers were moving through the passage, and 2 destroyers were moving with them, and one of those destroyers had just picked out the American submarine on the surface and swung hard to attack. This was exactly the situation the training manuals said to avoid. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A fleet destroyer coming at full speed across flat, moonlit water, bow on, 900 yards away, with a full spread of Type 95 depth charges and a crew that had drilled for exactly this moment. Commander Samuel David Dealey had been in the fleet submarine service for 10 years. He knew what the manuals said. He fired from the stern tubes anyway. 3 Mark 14 torpedoes ran through 800 feet of moonlit water. 2 of them hit. The destroyer Minazuki went down in 5 minutes, her own depth charges detonating as she sank, the underwater concussions rippling outward from where she had been. The fireball lit the passage briefly and then went out, and 45 men from Minazuki's crew survived to be rescued later. The second destroyer had been moving with the convoy, and now it swung toward Harder's position, and Dealey fired all 6 bow tubes in a full forward spread, and every single torpedo missed. The second destroyer rolled over them with its depth charge racks and held Harder down for long enough that the tanker convoy disappeared into the dark. When Harder finally broke free and surfaced to ventilate and recharge her batteries, Dealey filed a contact report and turned toward the anchorage. He was 6 miles from the largest concentration of Japanese naval power left in the Pacific. Every ship anchored there had destroyers around it, and the Harder had just announced her presence by sinking one of them in the approaches, in moonlight, in a passage that every vessel moving in or out of Tawi-Tawi had to transit. This was a start. Not the ending anyone would write to this story, but the start of the most consequential 4 days any American submarine crew would spend in the Pacific War. To understand what the Harder was doing in the Sibutu Passage that June, you have to understand what the passage itself was. The Sibutu Passage runs between the northeastern tip of Borneo and the Tawi-Tawi Island group at the southwestern corner of the Philippines, a corridor of deep water roughly 30 miles wide that connects the Celebes Sea to the Sulu Sea. Every ship moving from Tawi-Tawi to the Philippine Sea, which meant every ship of the Japanese 1st Mobile Force preparing for the coming decisive battle, had to transit through or near this corridor. There was no other route that didn't add days to the journey. The passage was, in navigational terms, a choke point. For a submarine, a choke point is a hunting ground. Tawi-Tawi itself was an anchorage of convenience more than design. The islands gave some shelter, and more importantly, Tarakan crude oil from the nearby Borneo fields could be bunkered directly into warships without the refining step that plants in Japan would have required. Japan's refineries were working at reduced capacity by 1944, and the raw crude from Tarakan could be burned directly in boilers, which was its own problem since Tarakan crude was volatile and prone to generating fumes that could collect in the hull, but it was fuel. The fleet needed fuel above everything. So Tawi-Tawi it was, with the fleet carriers and the battleships and the cruisers all anchored in relatively open water 6 miles from the mouth of the Sibutu Passage, waiting for the order to sortie. The Japanese had been planning the decisive engagement for 2 years, since Midway. Every plan they had written since the summer of 1942 had been premised on drawing the American fleet into a battle where land-based aircraft could supplement carrier aviation, where the Japanese torpedo armament could work at night, and where the superior Japanese gunnery at long range could offset the American numerical advantage. By June 1944, they were nearly out of time to fight this battle. The Americans were moving through the Central Pacific on a timetable that was going to bring them to the Marianas regardless of what the Japanese did, and the Marianas were close enough to the Japanese home islands that losing them was not survivable strategically. Toyota had to fight, and soon, and at Tawi-Tawi he had assembled the force to do it. What he did not know, on the night of June 6, 1944, was that one American submarine was already at the mouth of his anchorage. The Pacific Submarine Campaign in 1944 is sometimes described as the campaign that won the war before the invasion happened. That is probably too clean a formulation, but it is not wrong in its proportions. By the spring of 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant tonnage faster than Japanese shipyards could replace it, and the effects were compounding. Oil that had once moved in tankers from the Dutch East Indies refineries to the Japanese home islands now sat on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, and the warships and aircraft that needed that oil were beginning to feel the shortage. Destroyers were particularly affected. The Japanese Navy had lost more than 40 destroyers in the Solomon Islands campaign, in the runs to Guadalcanal, and the battles around it, and the production lines were not keeping pace. Ultra-code-breaking intelligence had revealed this to Admiral Lockwood's staff at COMSUBPAC. Beginning in April 1944, the guidance sent out to submarine commanders shifted. Japanese destroyers were now a higher priority target than merchant shipping. This was not a small thing to ask. A fleet destroyer is specifically designed to hunt and kill submarines. It is fast, 35 knots to a submarine's 9, and armed with depth charges and racks and projectors that can saturate a volume of water large enough to bracket any depth a Gato-class submarine can reach. The Type 95 sonar the Japanese used sent out an active pulse and measured the return. Its operators had become skilled at working a contact pattern. The lead ship holding the sonar contact, while flanking ships dropped charges in overlapping patterns designed to bracket whatever depth or heading the submarine chose. By 1944, Japanese destroyer crews had been hunting American submarines for 2.5 years. Some of them were very good at it. The standard American doctrine for surviving a destroyer attack was straightforward: go deep, reduce speed, go quiet, endure. The math of outrunning a destroyer underwater was not available to you. A submarine running at maximum submerged speed of 9 knots would drain its battery in under an hour and slow to a crawl. What you could do was find the right acoustic layer, where temperature differentials bent sonar pulses and made your hull harder to resolve, and hold position inside it until the fuel expenditure of a prolonged search pulled the destroyer away. This worked often enough that it remained the doctrine. It did not always work. The names on the memorial walls at Pearl Harbor and Groton belonged to the boats where it had not. What you were not supposed to do was turn and fight. The men who did the fighting inside a fleet submarine were living in conditions that required a specific kind of patience. A Gato-class submarine at sea had a working interior volume roughly comparable to a city bus, except that the city bus did not have 4 diesel engines, a torpedo room at each end, a control room, an officer's wardroom, a crew's mess, and a battery compartment running the length of the keel. The temperature in the forward torpedo room on a summer patrol ran hot enough that the torpedo men slept in their skivvies on top of the weapons they maintained, and the humidity from men breathing and the sea around them made everything perpetually damp. K-ration crackers went soft in their wrappers. Wool socks developed a particular smell that had no adequate civilian analogy. On the surface at night, the submarine could run the diesels and ventilate, and the air was ocean air, salt and clean, and the men who had the watch could feel the spray off the bow and look at the stars. Submerged in the day, the air recyclers kept enough oxygen in the boat to function, but the carbon dioxide built over a long dive, thickening the air just enough that after 8 hours down, thinking took slightly more effort and the headaches started in. A routine deep dive to avoid a search plane lasted 3 or 4 hours. An extended depth charge attack, if it went long, could hold a submarine under for most of a day. The crew of the Harder had been through 8 depth charge attacks over 3 patrols before the 5th patrol began. They knew the drill. They knew what it felt like when the sonar operator's voice came over the sound-powered phones and reported a contact bearing down, and what the next 30 seconds before the charges arrived were like, and what the first close charge did to loose gear and cracked gauge glass and a man's concentration. They had come through it 8 times. The 9th was going to be different, because on the 9th there would be more ships above than they had ever faced, and Dealey was not going to give the order to run. His Navy career before the war was 12 years of steadily accumulating professional competence, the kind of record that the peacetime promotion system recognized and rewarded. He had served on the battleship Nevada, done a tour on the destroyer Rathburn, gone through submarine school in New London in 1934, and served aboard 4 submarines, S-34, S-24, Nautilus, and Base, before being assigned command of the older S-20 for equipment testing in the years before the war. He had served as executive officer of the Reuben James, a four-stacker destroyer that would be torpedoed by the German submarine U-552 in October 1941, before America was officially in the war. The Reuben James went down with 115 men out of a crew of 160 in the North Atlantic, in a war the United States had not yet declared. Dealey had been reassigned in April of 1941, 6 months before the sinking. He had watched the Atlantic conflict build from inside a ship that was going to be one of the first American casualties. He understood, at a level below doctrine, that the enemy was going to do what the enemy was going to do, and that the question of survival in contested water was a question of geometry and nerve as much as a question of procedure. He was born in Dallas on September 13, 1906, graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930, and the Lucky Bag, the Academy yearbook, noted something about him that his crew would confirm in every action report they filed. The greater the stress, the more he smiled. His first 3 patrols in command of the Harder, between June 1943 and November of the same year, were solid operations against Japanese merchant shipping off the coast of Honshu and around the Marianas. Torpedo problems plagued the early patrols. The Mark 14 was notorious for its unreliable magnetic exploder and its tendency to run deeper than set, and Harder suffered through both failures like every other boat in the fleet. On the second patrol, Harder endured a sustained depth charge and aerial bomb attack, lasting nearly 48 hours off the coast of Honshu, long enough to bring the battery close to dangerous limits. The crew held the boat quiet and deep and came through it. Dealey brought his crew home each time. He was awarded Navy Crosses. The patrols were rated successful. But in the winter of 1943 and into 1944, while Harder was in the yards at Mare Island having her troublesome engines replaced, Dealey was thinking about the problem of the destroyer. The down-the-throat attack existed in pre-war doctrine as a theoretical option. The idea was geometrically sound. A destroyer making a high-speed attack run cannot deviate from its course without aborting the attack, so its future position is predictable. At very close range, the fire control solution became almost trivially simple. The problem was everything else about the situation. At the range where the geometry became reliable, the destroyer was already close enough to kill you if the torpedoes missed. You were committing yourself to a shot that had to work. What Dealey worked out, and what the record shows he acted on beginning with his 4th patrol, was that this was a more survivable option than the doctrine assumed, because the doctrine had not fully accounted for the speed of the modern torpedo relative to the reaction time of a destroyer crew. If you fired at under 1,000 yards with a 46-knot weapon, the interval between firing and impact was shorter than the interval between a destroyer captain's decision to evade and his ship actually evading. The window existed. It was narrow. It required holding your nerve at ranges that felt like you were watching the enemy come down your own throat. On April 13, 1944, 200 nautical miles south of Guam, the Japanese destroyer Ikazuchi gained contact on the Harder from an aircraft sighting and made her attack run. Dealey let her come in to 900 yards and fired. 2 of 4 torpedoes hit. Ikazuchi sank with no survivors. The contact report Dealey filed would become one of the most quoted documents in the Pacific Submarine Archive. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 Jap destroyer. The Ikazuchi, as a historical note, had rescued more than 400 survivors of the British cruiser HMS Exeter and the destroyer HMS Encounter after the Battle of the Java Sea 2 years earlier. She was not a random ship. She was a capable vessel with an experienced crew, and she was at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Lockwood read the patrol report and asked Dealey to present the technique at a gathering of submarine commanders. What had been a private calculation was now, from the spring of 1944 forward, part of the shared tactical knowledge of the American submarine force. What the presentation conveyed, and what no training manual had ever adequately described, was the specific experience of holding the periscope at close range on an oncoming destroyer. A destroyer making an attack run generates a bow wave visible in a periscope at 2,000 yards. At 1,500 yards, the wake is a white streak on the surface. At 1,000 yards, the hull is distinct and the bow wave is high and the screws are audible through the hull without needing the sonar. At 900 yards, where Dealey fired at the Ikazuchi, the destroyer filled the periscope field and the sound of her engines came through the hull as a vibration you could feel in the soles of your feet. The men in the forward torpedo room could hear it too. Every one of them knew that if Dealey's calculation was wrong by the width of a ship's beam, the charges would be coming down before the torpedoes reached their target. What Dealey had internalized, and what he passed to the commanders who heard his presentation in Pearl Harbor, was that the geometry was reliable at that range precisely because there was no variable left. A destroyer captain committed to an attack run at 900 yards with weapons armed and charges set could not turn without losing the attack. He was going to hold his course for another 10 seconds. The torpedoes running at 46 knots would cover 900 yards in roughly 35 seconds. The window was clear, the solution was locked, and the only thing required was the nerve to pull the trigger with a destroyer the size of a building coming directly at your periscope. Several submarine commanders who heard the presentation in the spring of 1944 would go on to use the technique. None of them used it as many times as Dealey would over the following weeks. Is the claim that Dealey was simply the most aggressive submarine commander in the Pacific, the destroyer killer, who attacked everything that moved without calculating the risk. The record corrects this. The NHC account of the 5th Patrol notes explicitly that Dealey was not foolhardy at all, and in several encounters he chose to disengage rather than attack if he didn't like the setup. What distinguished him was not aggression for its own sake. It was aggression applied at the specific moments when the geometry favored it, and the discipline to hold off when it didn't. That discipline was harder to maintain than the aggression. Any submarine commander could attack. Knowing when not to was the skill that kept the boat alive long enough to attack again. The 5th Patrol departed Fremantle, Australia, on May 26, 1944, initially in company with Redfin, SS 272. Dealey had lobbied Lockwood for the patrol area near Tawi-Tawi, understanding what ultra-intelligence had revealed about the fleet concentration there. The Japanese 1st Mobile Force had arrived at Tawi-Tawi in mid-May. Fleet carriers, fleet oilers, battleships including Yamato and Musashi, heavy cruisers, and the destroyer screen of a force built to fight one more decisive engagement. The anchorage had been chosen because Tarik and crude oil from nearby Borneo could be loaded directly into ship bunkers without refining. The fleet could refuel and wait for the moment Admiral Toyota judged most advantageous. What the anchorage did not have was an airfield. The Japanese were relying on the destroyer screen and occasional aircraft patrols from elsewhere to secure the approaches. Harder took station near the Sibutu Passage, the deep underwater channel between the northeastern tip of Borneo and the island of Mindanao, with the anchorage 6 nautical miles from her operating area. In the first days of the patrol, before the first shooting, Dealey conducted the reconnaissance that was the official reason for being there. The periscope views he was getting were extraordinary by the standards of any patrol ComSubPac had run in the previous 2 years. On clear days, through the scope at the right depth and bearing, Harder could see the masts of capital ships above the treeline of the Tawi-Tawi Islands. Battleship superstructures. The distinctive island structures of fleet carriers. The geometry of a fleet at anchor, spread over an area of water several miles across, each ship sitting with its screen of destroyers and picket boats around it. The contact reports that went back to Pearl Harbor from these observations, encoding the information through the standard cipher and transmitted in the watch windows when the boats surfaced to charge batteries, were giving Lockwood and, through him, Admiral Spruance a running picture of what was waiting on the other side of the Sibutu Passage. The killing was going to start, but the intelligence was already worth the patrol. On June 6th, she found the convoy. The destroyer Minazuki attacked and was sunk by the stern tube shot in the moonlit passage. The second destroyer drove Harder under with depth charges. On the morning of June 7th, a Japanese aircraft found Harder on the surface and directed the destroyer Hayanami in for an attack. Dealey made a hard turn as the destroyer closed, undetected, and fired 3 torpedoes. 2 struck amidships. The Hayanami suffered a magazine explosion and sank in under 1 minute. The official record shows that 208 of her crew were killed and 45 survived. A destroyer sinking in less than 60 seconds does not leave much time for the men inside her to understand what has happened to them. A depth charge attack from inside a submarine is a particular category of experience that the men who survived them described with a consistent set of details. The first charge was always the worst in one sense and the least threatening in another. It told you the destroyer had a contact, but it usually arrived wide, the crew above having set the initial pattern based on estimated position rather than precise sonar resolution. Then the pattern tightened. The overhead lights went first, knocked out by the shockwave, and the battle lanterns came on in their reddish glow. The cork insulation on the overhead bulkheads shed fine powder with each concussion, drifting down on men who had gone completely still, who were sitting on the decks or lying in their bunks with their eyes open, listening to the propeller sounds of the ships above them. Sound-powered phones passed whispered damage reports from compartment to compartment. A weeping seam somewhere forward. A gauge glass cracked aft. The trim pumps cycling carefully to maintain depth without creating noise that the sonar above might resolve into a contact. Dealey had been through this 7 times on previous patrols. The drill was the same. He moved aft into the conning tower and listened to the sonar operator's reports, placed the ships by bearing, estimated the pattern, and waited for the interval that would tell him whether they had a solid contact or were working a dead reckoning estimate. He would know within the first 6 charges. If they were walking the pattern toward him, the interval between detonations would tell him which direction they were working. He could use that. On the evening of June 7th, Harder moved to the northeastern coast of Borneo, and Dealey launched 2 folding rubber canoes that brought back 6 men from the beach in the dark. They were Australian soldiers of Special Reconnaissance Department Z Unit, coast watchers and intelligence operatives who had been operating behind Japanese lines and who were now in the confined space of a fleet submarine that had just sunk 2 Japanese destroyers in 24 hours, perhaps the most collected men aboard. Dealey assigned them bunks in the forward torpedo room and continued his patrol. The Australians were transferred to another vessel later in the operation. What the crew of the Harder were dealing with, in the hours between the Hayanami sinking and the next engagement, was the particular problem of a submarine that was exactly where the enemy knew it was. The Japanese had the general position. They had the datum of the Hayanami sinking, which gave them a point on the chart. They knew the submarine had to stay submerged during daylight, which meant it couldn't cover much ground, and they could bracket the search area with that knowledge. They were going to find the Harder again. The question was whether they would find her in a position where she could attack, or in a position where she would have to run. Dealey spent the daylight hours of June 8th rigging the boat for a night engagement, resting the crew in rotation, keeping depth charges loaded and ready, and making his calculations about the current and the depth. Profile of the passage. The Sibutu Passage is not uniformly deep. There are shallower areas near the island edges and a deeper central channel, and the thermocline, the layer where cold, deep water meets warmer surface water, varied in depth across the passage depending on time of day and the prevailing current. Dealey knew where the layer was. He intended to use it. The phrase that appears in multiple official accounts is numerous destroyers sortied from Tawi-Tawi, hunting for Harder. The first Mobile Forces destroyer screen at the time numbered roughly 17 warships of destroyer type, drawn from several destroyer divisions assigned to the various fleet elements. When 2 of those destroyers were gone in a day, and aircraft were reporting periscope sightings in the approaches, the command at Tawi-Tawi sent out the others. Not all 17 at once, but in rotating groups, covering the passages and approaches in sweeping search patterns, pinging with active sonar, and dropping pattern charges at any contact. What this looked like from the Harder sonar picture was a sea full of propeller noise. Multiple bearing changes compressing from different directions. The Type 95 sonar pulses coming in on different intervals from different headings, each one a separate ship working the same piece of ocean from a different angle. In a normal depth charge attack, you had 1 ship to track, maybe 2. Here the sonar operator was counting contacts on multiple bearings simultaneously, each one a possible threat, and each one a potential fire control solution if Dealey chose to use it. The operational calculation the Japanese were running was straightforward. Cover every approach route with overlapping sonar coverage, prosecute any contact to destruction, and commit enough ships that a submarine trying to evade one would inevitably run toward another. It was the correct doctrine for hunting a submarine that was trying to hide. It was less well designed for hunting a submarine that was trying to attack. Japanese destroyer crews in 1944 were experienced and capable. They had learned their anti-submarine trade in the brutal attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, where American submarines had tested them repeatedly. A crew that had survived the waters around Guadalcanal and Rabaul knew how to work a contact. What they were less prepared for was a contact that, on a clear sonar picture of an oncoming attack run, stopped being an evasion problem and became a fire control solution moving toward them at 46 knots. The evening of June 8 produced the engagement that the Medal of Honor citation would describe in measured official language. Harder encountered several Japanese destroyers searching in line abreast, a spread-out formation designed to cover a wide strip of ocean with overlapping sonar ranges. Dealey chose a position carefully, placing the submarine where two overlapping targets gave him a chance of hitting both with a single spread. The first torpedo missed ahead of the nearest destroyer. The second and third struck the Tanikaze. Her boilers went with her. She sank almost immediately. Of the 240 men in her crew, 114 were killed and 126 were rescued after the engagement, according to Japanese records. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The wartime credit given to Dealey at this point was for also hitting the far destroyer in the spread, the one he observed a blinding flash from. This would have been a fourth destroyer kill on the patrol. The Naval History and Heritage Command's post-war assessment notes that this fourth claim does not correlate with Japanese records, and the second ship may have been damaged rather than sunk, or the flash may have been from the Tanikaze's detonation reflecting off the water. Dealey received the credit. The honest accounting is 3 confirmed destroyer sinkings, a fourth that is contested, and the patrol was still unlike anything any American submarine commander had done before. Then came June 9th. On June 9th, the Harder was at periscope depth in the Sibutu Passage area when a Japanese aircraft spotted the scope and directed a screening escort toward her position. The force behind the escort was the Japanese battleship group that had been operating from Tawi-Tawi as part of the Operation KON effort. 3 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, and 4 cruisers, with destroyer screens around each. The escort that came at the Harder was doing exactly what escorts are designed to do, prosecuting a submarine contact at full speed to protect the capital ships behind it. It steamed at 35 knots on a direct heading with no reason to expect that the submarine it was attacking would do anything other than dive. Dealey swung the Harder's bow toward it. This was the geometry working in its most compressed form. A destroyer coming at maximum speed from a fixed bearing, its course constrained by its mission, its position predictable to the second. At 1,500 yards, he fired 3 torpedoes from the forward tubes, and then ordered a crash dive. The crash dive was immediate. The diving planes went hard over, the forward ballast tanks vented, the bow went down. The Harder was going from periscope depth to deep depth in the interval between firing and impact, trying to pass under the target before the target reached her. The citation's phrase, terrifically rocked seconds later by the exploding ship as the Harder passed beneath, describes what this felt like from inside. The explosion of a destroyer overhead, when you are passing under the hull at close range, is not like a depth charge. The pressure wave comes from above, and the shock transmits through the water with a directional component that rolls the boat. Loose gear moved. Men grabbed for handholds. The cork insulation shed. And then it was over, and the Harder was deep and accelerating away, and behind her the escort was gone. The Harder went deep and ran. In the hours between the June 9th attack and the June 11th reconnaissance of the empty anchorage, the Harder remained submerged through the daylight and came up only at night to ventilate and recharge. The Japanese search had not found her. The thermocline had done its work. What the search had done was consume time and fuel that the Japanese Fleet Command had not budgeted for a prolonged anti-submarine operation. And the days lost to the Harder hunt were days lost to the preparation and coordination that Operation Ego required. On June 11, 1944, Dealey brought Harder to periscope depth in the approaches to Tawi-Tawi and swept the anchorage. It was empty. The entire first mobile force, battleships, carriers, cruisers, the remaining destroyers, the oilers, all of it was gone. Admiral Toyota had sent the fleet out. What had happened inside the Japanese command at Tawi-Tawi in the days between June 6th and June 11th was a compound of accurate information and catastrophic misinterpretation. The accurate information was the succession of sinking reports. Minazuki gone, Hayanami gone, Tanikaze gone, all in the approaches to the anchorage that the mobile force needed to transit on its way to the decisive battle. The misinterpretation was that this was the work of many submarines. The contact reports, the periscope sightings from aircraft, the depth charge attacks, the accumulating losses, all pointed in Toyota's assessment to a coordinated American submarine barrier that had saturated the approach routes. In fact, the Harder was essentially the only American submarine in the area during this period. Redfin was operating in the Celebes Sea, some distance away. The sheer density of Dealey's attacks and the contact reports generated by them had convinced the admiral commanding Japan's most important naval force that submarines were swarming his anchorage, when the reality was one Gato-class submarine with one commander who had made a calculated decision to stay and fight. Fearing further losses to his destroyer screen and unwilling to let the mobile force sit at anchor while submarines reduced it piece by piece, Toyota sent the fleet out a day earlier than his operational plan had intended. The disruption was real. The first mobile force arrived in the Philippine Sea with its timing and coordination not quite what the plan had called for, with 3 destroyers fewer than it had started with, and having spent days of fuel on anti-submarine operations that had failed to find the submarine it was hunting. When it met Task Force 58 on June 19th, the results were what they were. Dealey radioed the intelligence to Pearl Harbor. Admiral Spruance and Task Force 58 received the first firm confirmation that the Japanese fleet was on the move. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 19, 1944. American carrier aviation destroyed more than 400 Japanese aircraft and most of Japan's remaining trained carrier pilots. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. It became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The men who flew those aircraft over the Philippine Sea were connected, by a chain of decisions made in the Sibutu Passage 2 weeks earlier, to one American submarine and its commander. Harder returned to Darwin on June 21st, ending the 5th War Patrol. Dealey had been at sea for 26 days. He had sunk 3 destroyers confirmed, possibly 4, and had fired a down-the-throat shot at a fleet escort with 3 battleships watching. General Douglas MacArthur was at Darwin when Harder arrived, and he presented Dealey on the spot with an Army Distinguished Service Cross. Lockwood's endorsement of the patrol report described it as the most brilliant American submarine action of the war. The Presidential Unit citation that followed named the 5th Patrol in terms that the citation form did not normally accommodate. There was nothing in the citations office's standard language for what had happened in the Sibutu Passage. Within ComSubPAC's command structure, the 5th Patrol report circulated in the weeks that followed in the way that exceptional reports do, passed among commanders and operations officers, and marked up in margins with questions and observations. The down-the-throat technique had been demonstrated on the 4th Patrol and distributed in Dealey's Pearl Harbor presentation. Now the 5th Patrol had shown what the technique produced when applied by a commander who had also mastered the discipline of choosing when to attack and when to disengage, and who had the situational awareness to read a patrol area as a whole rather than reacting to each contact in isolation. Other submarine commanders were studying the report not to copy the specific attacks, but to understand the underlying logic, the way Dealey had assessed each encounter, chosen his geometry, held his nerve at close range, and then used the resulting chaos to break contact and survive. Several of those commanders would go on to use variations of the down-the-throat approach in subsequent patrols. The technique had entered the institutional knowledge of the submarine force in a way that would outlast the Harder and outlast the war. What Dealey had done in the Sibutu Passage was not just to sink ships. He had changed how the people around him thought about the problem. Dealey received orders for a 6th Patrol. He departed Fremantle on August 5, 1944, this time with Hato, SS 255, and Hake, SS 256, in a coordinated wolf pack. The patrol area was west of Luzon in the Philippines. The strategic situation had shifted since June. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had left Japanese naval aviation effectively destroyed, but the remaining surface forces were still active, still screening convoys, still fighting. The Japanese had reinforced their anti-submarine forces in the Philippine waters. They knew American submarines were operating there. What they had learned from the 5th Patrol, if they had learned it, was that one of those submarines was something different. The Wolfpack worked the western Philippine coast through mid-August, intercepting Japanese convoys and reporting traffic. On August 20th and afterward, the boats were tracking Japanese ship movements in the area. On the morning of August 24, 1944, Harder and Hake were operating near Hermanum Mayer Island, a small landform off the Luzon coast at the entrance to Desal Bay. Just before dawn, they sighted a Japanese vessel identified at the time as PB-102 with an escort. PB-102 was, in fact, not a standard Japanese warship. It was the former USS Stewart, DD-224, an American destroyer that the Japanese had raised from a flooded dry dock at Surabaya, Indonesia, where she had been scuttled after the fall of the Dutch East Indies, overhauled, and put back into service under the Japanese flag. The irony of this is the kind of detail that war produces in quantity. One of the ships involved in the last hours of USS Harder was an American destroyer wearing enemy colors. PB-102 entered Desal Bay. The escort remained outside, active on its sonar, pinging. Then the escort turned toward Hake's position. What happened next is documented in the account of Hake's commanding officer and in Japanese records. Dealey moved the Harder between the escort and Hake. He interposed his submarine in the escort's track to draw the attack away from his companion. The Japanese vessel prosecuted the contact, and by the known account 15 depth charges were dropped in the resulting attack. Hake heard the Harder's screws one more time after the attack began, and then did not hear them again. The Harder's periscope was not seen to rise. No contact was ever re-established. The commanding officer of Hake reported hearing a series of depth-charge detonations followed by what he described as an unusually large underwater explosion, the kind of secondary detonation that follows when a pressure hull fails catastrophically or when a magazine or torpedo warhead goes with the ship. What the failure sequence was inside the Harder in those minutes, whether the pressure hull cracked first or whether a close charge detonated ammunition or a torpedo warhead, is not in the record. The ocean does not return that kind of accounting. What the record has is the last transmission from the Harder, the last sonar contact reported by Hake, and then the specific silence that follows a boat that will not surface. The USS Harder was declared overdue and presumed lost on September 6, 1944. She was gone with her crew. The complement for the 6th Patrol numbered 80 men. Samuel David Dealey was 37 years old. He had been at submarine school in New London when he was 28. He had been on the Reuben James when she was destroyed. Before the war he was killed and had officially started. He had commissioned the Harder and taken her on every one of her 6 patrols. His wife, Edwine, received the Medal of Honor from President Truman at the White House on November 15, 1945, 14 months after the Harder went down. The ceremony at the White House was the kind of event that the official photographic record preserves in formal images. A woman in a good dress accepting a small blue ribbon case, the president in a dark suit, the polished floors of a room designed for occasions like this one. What the photographs do not show is the gap between the decoration and the man it was awarded for, the 14 months between Desal Bay and that room, the arithmetic of a family trying to understand what a medal means when the person it honors went into the Pacific Ocean on a submarine and did not come out. Military awards for posthumous valor are acts of recognition, and recognition is better than its absence, but it is not the same thing as the person it is meant to honor. The Medal of Honor citation described 5 Japanese destroyers sunk in 5 short-range torpedo attacks, which was the wartime credit. Post-war reconciliation with Japanese records confirmed 3 sinkings without dispute and placed the 4th and 5th in the uncertain territory that all wartime kill claims occupy when tested against the records of the other side. 3 confirmed destroyer sinkings by a single submarine commander in a single patrol is a record that stands without embellishment in the history of the Pacific War. It is worth sitting with what 3 confirmed destroyer sinkings in 3 days actually means in a technical sense. The Japanese Navy went into the Pacific War with 111 fleet destroyers. By 1944, losses in the Solomons Campaign, Midway, and the Philippine battles had reduced that number significantly, and production was not keeping pace. Lockwood's intelligence, drawn from Ultra, showed the shortage in the escort and screening forces that protected Japan's shipping lanes and fleet movements. A single destroyer represented not just the steel hull and the guns, but the 100-plus trained specialists required to crew her, the months of workup time to bring a crew to fighting effectiveness, and the irreplaceable role in a fleet structure that was already running short of experienced officers and enlisted men. 3 such ships gone in 72 hours, from a force that could not easily replace them, was not merely an operational loss. It was a structural one. The Japanese shipbuilding program had prioritized capital ship repair and submarine production in 1943 and 1944, and the destroyer construction rate was insufficient to replace the attrition from 2 years of convoy escort duty and fleet screen operations. The destroyers lost at Tawi-Tawi in June 1944 were not going to be replaced before Leyte Gulf for months later. They were not going to be replaced before Okinawa. The holes they left in the screening arrangements for Japanese fleet movements, and for the convoys that were still trying to supply Japan's garrison armies across the Pacific, would remain holes. Each destroyer Dealey sent to the bottom in the Sibutu Passage was a gap in Japan's naval architecture that the Japanese Navy could not close. What the citation could not fully describe, because it was a citation and not a historical analysis, was what Dealey's 5th Patrol had actually accomplished beyond the immediate kills. The 17 destroyers that sortied from Tawi-Tawi to hunt him represented a significant fraction of the screen force that was supposed to protect Japan's last major fleet concentration. 3 of those destroyers did not come home. The others spent days in a search that consumed fuel and time and gave Japan's carrier force an overture of chaos rather than the disciplined departure that Operation Ego required. The intelligence report that Dealey filed from periscope depth over the empty anchorage on June 11 gave Admiral Spruance the knowledge he needed to position Task Force 58 for the fleet engagement. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not caused by the 5th Patrol of the Harder, but it was shaped by it, in ways the participants at every level could trace in the record afterward. The Harder's patrol report, and the tactics that produced it, were studied at the Naval War College. The down-the-throat attack method, refined by later commanders who had better torpedoes and more precise fire control computers, remained in the training curriculum at New London through the Cold War. The principle Dealey had demonstrated in the Sibutu Passage, that a submarine commander who understood the geometry of his situation with enough precision could take offensive action at moments when doctrine said only evasion was possible, proved durable because it was not really a doctrine. It was a way of thinking about problems. There is a broader point the 5th Patrol illustrates about the Pacific submarine campaign, one that the post-war record makes consistently. The campaign was not won by any single patrol or any single commander. It was won by the accumulation of 1,547 patrols completed by American submarines between December 1941 and August 1945, sinking more than 1,100 merchant vessels and over 200 warships, strangling a resource-dependent island nation's ability to sustain a war it could no longer feed or fuel. That accumulation required the ordinary, grinding, dangerous work of approaching convoys in bad weather and firing at ships that were trying to kill you and coming home with whatever the patrol had produced. Most patrols produced less than the Harder's 5th. The 5th Patrol was exceptional because of what Dealey had worked out about the geometry of the problem. The other 80-some patrols Lockwood's boats were running at the same time the Harder was in the Sibutu Passage were exceptional for different reasons. The campaign was all of them. But Dealey's 5th Patrol stands as the clearest single demonstration of what a submarine commander could do when the aggressive option was precisely calculated rather than recklessly pursued, and when the nerve to hold that calculation under pressure was backed by 10 years of knowing the machinery and the ocean well enough to trust both at the moment it mattered. There is a particular kind of courage that belongs specifically to the men who fought in submarines in the Second World War, and it is not quite the same kind that shows up in the citations for ground soldiers or surface ship sailors. It is not the courage of a trench or a beachhead, where the threat comes from a direction you can see and the option to run is at least theoretically present. It is the courage of a sealed metal tube in the dark, where the threat comes from all directions at once, where the options are defined by physics and battery charge and the judgment of one man at a periscope, and where the choice between attacking and running has to be made before the sonar picture is complete. The men of the Harder made that choice, over 6 patrols in 2 years, following a commander who had thought through the geometry before they got there. They did not know, most of them, exactly what Dealey's calculations were in the moments before he gave the order to fire. They knew that he had thought about it, that the smile the lucky bag had noted 30 years before was not bravado but composure, and that the order, when it came, was the right one. That knowledge, in the dark of a pressure hull at combat depth, is what the record asks us to understand about these men and what they carried with them into the Pacific. There is one last thing the record shows about the end. Dealey did not have to put the Harder between the escort and Hake on the morning of August 24th. The tactical decision to interpose his submarine in the path of an enemy anti-submarine vessel, to draw the depth charge attack away from another American boat, was the kind of decision that the lucky bag's observation anticipated. The greater the stress, the more he smiled. What the record shows in the gap between that decision and the silence that followed is a man doing what he had always done, at closer range than anyone could plan for, in the one moment when the geometry of his situation meant someone was going to take the hit. He made sure it was him. The 80 men of the USS Harder are listed on the walls of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines, where the remains of those lost at sea in the Pacific have no place to be brought back from. Their names are there because they earned the right to be there, not in spite of the fact that the ship was lost, but because of the specific choices the men inside it made, patrol after patrol, from the first watch off the coast of Honshu in June 1943 to the last morning at the entrance to Daesal Bay in August 1944. Samuel David Dealey. The officers and enlisted men who served with him, some for one patrol and some for all 6. The crew of the 5th War Patrol, who went into the approaches of the largest Japanese fleet concentration of 1944 and came back with 3 destroyers to their credit and intelligence that would change the shape of the war. The crew of the 6th, who followed their commander into the last approach and did not come back. The sonar operators who counted propeller bearings in the dark, who sat with headphones pressed to their skulls and distinguished one destroyer's cavitation from another's by the sound alone, and who gave Dealey the picture he needed to fire. The torpedo men who maintained and loaded weapons that, on the first patrol, had run too deep and failed to detonate, and who by the 5th patrol were putting them on target in the approaches to Tawi-Tawi with enough precision to hit a destroyer turning at 35 knots in the night. The officers of the deck who brought the boat up to periscope depth when the depth charge pattern had passed and the ocean above was quiet enough to risk a look. Every man who held the trim of a submarine steady while the hull groaned around him and waited to find out whether the next charge would be close enough to matter. Their names are in the record. They are worth carrying. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.